As a teenager, his sister became pregnant. A sentence that echoes through the dark mountains of Tennessee, carrying decades of silence and shame. This is the history of the Sullivan family, whose roots intertwined in prohibited ways deep in the Appalachians, resulting in consequences that transcended whole generations. The year was 1967. While freedom movements and the Vietnam War dominated the headlines in America, a completely different world existed in the isolated mountains of eastern Tennessee. In a remote community known as Valley of Shadows, the Sullivan family lived virtually disconnected from modern society. Thomas Sullivan, the 48-year-old patriarch, had built a life away from public scrutiny since his wife's death 5 years prior. Alone in a rudimentary cabin, he raised his 4 children: Elijah, the oldest at 19, Margaret, 16, Sarah, 13, and the youngest, Timothy, just 9 years old. To the local community, the Sullivans were just another poor family imprisoned in the mountains, fighting for survival against the difficulties of mountain life. This isolation was no accident. For 3 generations, the Sullivans had deliberately stayed away from the outside world. Thomas's father was a cousin of his own mother, and Thomas himself had married a second-degree cousin. In the most isolated communities of the Appalachians at that time, this pattern of relationships was not completely uncommon. The first signs that something disturbing was occurring at the Sullivan cabin emerged when Margaret, at 16, began to miss class at the small school. Professor Mary Whitfield, one of the few people who kept regular contact with the family, noticed the teenager's prolonged absence. Margaret has always been a quiet but intelligent girl, Mary later reported in her statement. When she stopped coming to school and her brother Elijah began to make increasingly elaborate excuses, I felt something was wrong. What Mary couldn't imagine was the dimension of the horror unfolding within that cabin. Elijah Sullivan, the older brother, had developed an inappropriate relationship with his sister Margaret. Exploiting their father's frequent absences for work on neighboring farms, Elijah had begun to dominate his sister, a situation that eventually resulted in pregnancy. I realized that Margaret was wearing increasingly wide clothes, even on hot days, her younger sister Sarah later recalled. Elijah forbade us to talk about it. He said Margaret was sick and that it was a family matter. Characterized by control and fear were the dynamics of the Sullivan family. After his mother's death, Elijah had assumed a position of disproportionate authority. Consumed by work and mourning, Thomas did not realize how his eldest son had twisted the family hierarchy. The situation reached a critical point when Mary Whitfield, the worried teacher, decided to visit the Sullivan cabin after almost 4 months without seeing Margaret. What she found would forever change that family's fate. It was a rainy October afternoon when Mary traveled the muddy road to the Sullivans' isolated property. Upon arrival, she found Margaret alone, visibly pregnant, and in a state of profound emotional suffering. She was sitting in the basement of the house, looking like a completely different person, Mary reported in her later statement to social services. When she saw me, she started to cry in a way I will never forget. It was at that moment that the first layer of the Sullivan secret began to unravel, revealing a behavioral pattern that extended for generations, yet had never been confronted so directly. Check to see if you are already subscribed to this channel. If you value real stories that expose hidden truths of American society, you cannot miss our next episodes. Each subscription helps us continue revealing these forgotten stories that, as painful as they may be, need to be told to understand our own history. Mary Whitfield's visit to the Sullivan cabin triggered a series of events that would bring decades of family secrets to light. After finding Margaret in an advanced state of pregnancy, the teacher contacted the local authorities. Sheriff John Caldwell, a 54-year-old man who had spent his entire life in the county, was the one who answered the call. Arriving at the Sullivan property the next day, he found a scene that, even after 30 years of police work, would disturb him for the rest of his life. "I entered that cabin and immediately realized that something was deeply wrong," Caldwell reported in his 1967 official records. The girl was clearly pregnant. Her older brother seemed threatening, and her father simply avoided looking at any of them. During the initial interrogation, the family tried to maintain the story that Margaret had been involved with a boy from another community who had left to fight in Vietnam. But Sarah, the 13-year-old sister, eventually revealed the truth to the sheriff when questioned separately. Elijah said, "We were special," were Sarah's words recorded in the police report. He said that in the mountains, old families like ours had different rules from the people in the city. What followed was an investigation that revealed not only the improper relationship between Elijah and Margaret, but also a disturbing generational pattern. The Sullivan family records, when finally examined, showed a lineage marked by unions between close cousins for at least 4 generations. The case gained the attention of Dr. William Thornton, a doctor at the small local clinic who had studied at Johns Hopkins University. Thornton immediately recognized the physical signs of prolonged consanguinity in the family. Timothy, the youngest, had significant learning difficulties and an atypical cranial conformation, Dr. Thornton noted in his medical report. Sarah demonstrated severe vision problems and impaired motor development. These are classic signs of a high degree of consanguineous lineage. Elijah Sullivan was arrested and formally accused, but the 1967 judiciary in rural and conservative Tennessee was poorly equipped to deal with such a complex case. Authorities debated whether to treat it as a conventional crime or as the result of isolated cultural practices demanding a different approach. In the weeks that followed, local social services, extremely limited at the time, tried to support Margaret. The 16-year-old was now in her 7th month of pregnancy, confused and traumatized. She didn't fully understand what had happened to her, explained Elizabeth Morrow, the social worker assigned to the case. Margaret grew up in a separate world, where the normal rules of society did not apply. The history of the Sullivans began to spread across the region, first as whispers and then as a disturbing case study of what could happen in isolated communities. For locals, the situation caused a mixture of horror and a reluctant recognition that there were mountain families who lived by their own rules. The investigation revealed even more disturbing details about the family dynamics. Thomas Sullivan, the father, had grown up under similar conditions. His own father had married a close cousin, and geographical and social isolation had been a deliberate strategy for generations. Parish records from the small local church dating from the 1910s already mentioned concerns about mountain families that refused to mix. A pastor of that time had tried to intervene but found fierce resistance and eventually gave up. But it was Margaret's health that most worried the doctors now involved in the case. At 6 months of pregnancy, she showed alarming signs. Her blood pressure was dangerously high, and initial examinations suggested the fetus could have serious malformations. A pregnancy resulting from close consanguinity carries significantly increased risks, Dr. Thornton explained in the medical records. The harmful recessive genes, which would usually remain dormant in a diverse population, are much more likely to be expressed when close relatives have children. Knoxville University Hospital, with its lighted corridors and teams of doctors in white coats, represented a completely foreign world to Margaret Sullivan. The 16-year-old, who had spent all her life in the mountain shadows, was now under fluorescent lights, surrounded by machines whose purpose she barely understood. Dr. Richard Coleman, a high-risk obstetric specialist, assumed the case after Margaret's transfer. His first meeting with the teenager was recorded in his memory and later in his medical records. The patient had clear signs of chronic malnutrition and a lack of basic prenatal care, noted Dr. Coleman. Additionally, I observed subtle but distinctive facial characteristics that suggested she was already the product of some degree of consanguinity. The initial exams confirmed the local doctor's concerns. Margaret's pregnancy, the result of a union with her biological brother, had multiple complications. An ultrasound, a relatively new technology in 1967, revealed the fetus had abnormal brain development and possible heart malformations. When we performed the first ultrasound, the whole team was silent, Nurse Janet Wilkins recalled years later. It was an image none of us were prepared to see. While doctors debated the course of action, Margaret's health continued to deteriorate. She developed preeclampsia, a dangerous condition characterized by high blood pressure. The medical team was forced to induce birth prematurely when Margaret was about 32 weeks into gestation. The birth occurred on a timely night in November 1967. The baby, a boy, came into the world with multiple congenital conditions, including microcephaly, cardiac defects, and pronounced facial deformities. He was immediately placed in neonatal intensive care. While Margaret was fighting for her own life, the baby, temporarily recorded as male Sullivan baby, lived only 72 hours. His organs, compromised by multiple malformations, were unable to support basic vital functions. Sedated for much of that time, Margaret never saw her son. The death of the Sullivan baby was not only a personal tragedy but also a case study that would later be documented in medical literature on the genetic risks of close consanguinity. Dr. Coleman, with judicial authorization, collected samples for genetic studies that would reveal alarming patterns of homozygosity. While the Sullivan baby became a study case, Margaret faced her own process of physical and psychological recovery. The young woman now had to process not only the physical trauma but also the gradual understanding of the nature of her relationship with her brother and the family practices normalized in her environment. She was repeatedly asked about her family, especially about Sarah and Timothy, said psychologist Dr. Marianne Lewis, assigned to her case. Margaret did not show the conventional understanding that what had happened was wrong. For her, it was simply the world she knew. Meanwhile, the judicial case against Elijah Sullivan continued. District Prosecutor Richard Bennett faced the challenge of prosecuting a case that, while clearly criminal by the standards of wider society, was rooted in isolated cultural practices. In court, Sarah Sullivan, then 14, was called to witness. Her testimony, protected from the press due to her age, was described by those present as deeply disturbing. She detailed how Elijah had gradually assumed family control after their mother's death. Elijah always said that the outside world wanted to destroy our family, Sarah's testimony stated. He said that our ancestors had moved to the valley to preserve our blood and that it was our responsibility to continue what they had started. I want you to say in the comments, the truth needs to be exposed even when painful. This message represents our collective commitment to the revelation of stories that, however difficult, help us understand the complexity of the human condition. When the fall of 1968 painted the Tennessee mountains with shades of red and gold, the Valley of Shadows looked the same as usual to the detached eye. But for those who knew its recent history, something fundamental had changed. The Sullivan cabin remained in the same place, but it was empty, its darkened windows like closed eyes. Elijah Sullivan had been sentenced to 15 years in prison, a sentence considered severe at the time. When giving the sentence, Judge Arthur Blackwood made it clear that the case represented a line that could not be crossed, even in the most isolated communities. Traditions have their place in society, said Judge Blackwood. But when cultural practices result in evident damage to vulnerable family members, the law must intervene. Thomas Sullivan, the patriarch, faced his own judgment for neglect and passive complicity. Although he received a suspended sentence due to a psychological evaluation that identified limited cognitive capacity, possibly the result of generations of consanguinity, he permanently lost custody of his minor children. For Sarah and Timothy, the younger siblings, a new phase of life began. Initially placed in temporary homes, they were eventually welcomed by adoptive families. The adaptation process was particularly challenging for Timothy, whose cognitive limitations required specialized care. Timothy had not only intellectual challenges but also a profound confusion about basic social norms, his adoptive mother, Ruth Campbell, explained in later interviews. He had grown up in an environment where family limits were distorted to the point of being unrecognizable. For Sarah, the transition was different but equally complex. Intellectually insightful, she wrestled with conflicting feelings of family loyalty and a growing understanding of the abnormal character of her upbringing. "I loved my family," Sarah confided to her therapist. "But as I started living with the foster family and attending a normal school, I realized that what happened in our cabin was not how other families lived." Margaret, meanwhile, faced her own process of recovery and rediscovery. After months in a specialized institution, she was gradually introduced to a semi-independent living program. In 1970, at age 19, she had developed basic skills to work in wider society, although the emotional trauma remained deeply rooted. Margaret has made remarkable progress considering her starting point, said Dr. Lewis in his final report. She learned to read more fluently, developed basic social skills, and began to form a healthier understanding of appropriate relationships. One of the most lasting consequences of the Sullivan case was its impact on the medical and scientific understanding of consanguinity. The genetic samples collected from the deceased baby and subsequent studies of the family lineage became reference material in research on the effects of unions between close relatives. Dr. Thornton, continuing his work on population genetics, identified what he called the Sullivan effect, the exponential increase in genetic risks when a lineage already compromised by generations of consanguinity experiences sibling unions. The Sullivan case has allowed us to document how risks accumulate throughout generations, Norwood explained in a lecture at Johns Hopkins University in 1973. Each generation of close relatives increases homozygosity, the presence of identical genes inherited from both parents. Case studies of the Sullivans significantly contributed to the development of genetic counseling as a medical discipline. As the 1970s advanced, doctors began to apply these lessons not only to isolated communities but also to populations with high rates of consanguineous marriages around the world. In 1975, almost 8 years after the initial events, a university documentary film team visited the region to produce an educational film about isolated Appalachian communities. Although it did not mention the Sullivans by name, the documentary Mountain Shadows addressed issues of isolation, poverty, and marriage practices in remote communities. One of the most impactful moments was an anonymous interview with a young woman that informed viewers recognized as Sarah Sullivan, then 21 years old. With her face obscured and voice altered to protect her identity, she offered a unique perspective. "Outside people see only the horror of the situation," she said in the documentary. And yes, it was horrible, but it was also our daily reality. We grew up believing that the outside world was dangerous and that only our family was safe. The winter of 1990 arrived early in the Tennessee mountains, covering the peaks with a white cloak in November. In the small town of Cedar Ridge, approximately 70 kilometers from the old Valley of Shadows, Nurse Sarah Morris, formerly Sullivan, watched the snow through the window of her small home. At 36, Sarah had built a life few could have predicted. A nursing graduate specializing in rural health, she had married David Morris, a local teacher, and adopted a girl, having consciously decided not to have biological children based on her family history. "Before we got married, I told David everything about my family," Sarah said in a personal diary later donated to the University of Tennessee. "I explained the genetic risks I could carry and my fear of passing on any hereditary predisposition." One December morning of that year, Sarah received a letter that would reopen chapters of her life she had worked hard to reconcile. The letter came from Elijah, her brother, who had been released from prison 3 years prior after serving his full 15-year sentence. "Dear Sarah," the letter began, "I know you probably don't want to hear from me, and I understand if you throw this card out without reading it. But if you're reading this, I want you to know that I have spent the last 20 years trying to understand what I did and why I did it." For Sarah, the letter represented a collision between her carefully compartmentalized past and the life she had built. For years, she had balanced two identities: Sarah Morris, the respected community nurse, and Sarah Sullivan, the survivor of a family marked by practices society considered abominable. After days of deliberation, Sarah decided to respond to Elijah's letter, starting a cautious correspondence that would eventually lead to a supervised meeting in 1991. This reunion, facilitated by a specialized family therapist, marked a significant moment not only for the Sullivan siblings but also for the professionals who had followed the case over decades. Margaret Sullivan had followed a different path. After years in support programs, she had found stability working in the kitchen of a Knoxville hospital. Refusing to change her last name and maintaining a consciously limited connection with her past, she had developed a quiet but functional life. In 1992, when academic interest in the Sullivan case resurfaced on the 25th anniversary of the original events, Margaret surprised many by agreeing to participate in an interview for a resilience study in trauma survivors. "People always ask if I hate my brother or my father," she said in the interview. "The truth is more complicated. How can I completely hate people who, in their own distorted way, believed they were following the rules of the only world they knew? But also, how can I not feel angry for what was taken from me? Both things are true at the same time." Timothy Sullivan, the youngest member of the original family, continued to live in a support facility. His cognitive and physical problems, possibly resulting from generations of consanguinity, had limited his options. But within a structured environment, he had found a measure of satisfaction. The scientific and medical impact of the Sullivan case continued to evolve with advancements in genetics. In the 1990s, with the development of more sophisticated genetic analysis and the Human Genome Project, researchers revisited the preserved samples and case data. In 1995, the Tennessee Health Department established the Mountain Health Program, an initiative designed to provide health education and medical services to isolated rural communities. Though never explicitly mentioned, the program was widely inspired by the lessons learned from the Sullivan case. The old Sullivan cabin, abandoned for decades, finally collapsed during a winter storm in 1997, symbolically marking the end of an era. In the place where an isolated and dysfunctional family once lived, the forest had reclaimed its territory. In 2000, 33 years after the original events, the University of Tennessee established the Sullivan Center for Rural Studies, dedicated to research on geographical isolation, cultural practices in remote communities, and appropriate interventions for vulnerable populations. "We can't change what happened," Sarah said at the inauguration ceremony, publicly talking about her history for the first time. "But we can guarantee that the suffering of our family was not in vain. That the lessons learned will continue to protect other vulnerable families for generations to come." "People want simple stories," Margaret noted in her last known interview in 2002. "They want monsters and victims, villains and heroes. But the truth is almost never so simple. Our family was created by generations of isolation, ignorance, and fear. What happened to us was terrible, but it was also the result of forces larger than any individual. If you watched this far, it is because you liked this story. Leave a comment saying, 'I watched here,' so I can meet you and know who really likes the stories here on the channel. Be sure to subscribe to follow more stories like this that reveal the dark secrets of American families. Your support is critical for us to continue bringing these important stories that, however painful, need to be told." If this story has touched you in any way, please leave your like and share it with people who also appreciate educational content about historical cases. The truth needs to be exposed even when painful.